the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, October the 15th, 2024. 3 weeks to you-know-what. And we're in the silly season, I guess, in some ways of the election, where everyone claims that the other side is trying to take America over, corrupt America, make America bad. My guest today on the show, Talia Lavin, has a new book out, Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. It's out today, and Talia is joining us from New York City. Talia, congratulations on the new book. But are the Christian right really trying to take over America? Is that a little bit of an exaggeration, or is that actually true?
No, it's true. I don't think it's part of the silly season to say so. I think if you look at the Speaker of the House, if you look at the majority on the Supreme Court, if you look at Donald Trump's sort of most vocal supporters, you are seeing the Christian right in action, and really the culmination of 50 years of building power in American institutions, particularly in the courts and the judiciary. So we see all these unpopular theocratic laws being passed, these abortion bans. We're seeing really sweeping promises being given to the Christian right from one of the two major candidates. And so I don't think it's actually hyperbole to say that this is what we're witnessing is, a takeover, an attempted takeover.
Talia, in the Federalist Papers, James Madison famously argued that the whole point of the American system was to protect America from factions. So he designed, or he and the other founders designed, a balance of power system. So one branch of government would be balanced with another. And the premise of this was that everyone forms into faction, and all factions are determined to have their way. So whether it's the Christian right, or labor unions, or business leaders, or Silicon Valley, everyone's in the business, so to speak, of taking over America, because everyone wants to pursue their own agenda. Is the Christian right different from that?
Yes and no. I think one thing that distinguishes the Christian right is that for them, the stakes are, very much not solely material. So that a labor union might be struggling for fair wages or better work hours, whereas on the Christian right, the view is very much seen as a conflict between good and evil and a battle for the soul of the nation. And I mean soul sometimes at the expense of the bodies of Americans.
And that's, of course, S-O-U-L rather than S-O-L-E.
Yes, S-O-U-L. And so this is sort of an existential battle that they're waging, a battle against, and if you look at their literature and their statements, they very much see the presence of Lucifer, the presence of demons in American politics on a daily basis. So, I think a faction that believes themselves to be fighting Satan does distinguish itself by virtue of the stakes they believe to be in play, and also how far they're willing to go.
Speaking of stakes, I saw Herzog's Nosferatu at the weekend. Of course, classic film, a different kind of stakes, and Dracula and all the rest of it. But in all seriousness, going back to to Madison and the founding fathers, the American political system was designed to separate church and state. Now, I take your point about the Christian rights agenda being driven by perhaps more than just material interests. Is the Christian right today, in its threat, and clearly you're no great fan of the Christian right, is it breaking those basic church-state division laws that were the core of the American Republic?
I mean, first of all, Christopher Lee will always be Dracula to me. I'm a huge fan of Hammer horror. So if we're talking about
Klaus Kinski was pretty good too.
Yeah, but Lee really has that presence in terms of dramatic Englishman. Yeah, I mean, church and state, it's a very, like, the firewall of separation. It's a very nice concept. And I'm sure the founders had a lot to say. I mean, they also didn't perceive of women or people of color as people. So it's safe to say their understanding was perhaps flawed. And maybe we shouldn't be looking at, every single word of what they wrote 250 years ago as minutely applicable to our present state of politics. But more to the point, if you live in Alabama, if you live in Arkansas, if you live in Iowa, if you live in Idaho, and someone says, oh, the church and state are fundamentally separate, that's a joke. These laws that are being passed, specifically the abortion bans, but also laws that, prohibit trans people essentially from participating in public life, laws that support corporal punishment in public schools. Many of these laws are done with an explicitly Christian, are passed with explicitly Christian rationalizations. Many of these legislators are, explicitly religious and seeking to enact a religious agenda. So maybe some of that pertains on the federal level, although again, given the composition of our Supreme Court, several of whom are open religious extremists, if we're talking about the conservative majority at this moment, that's doubtful. If we're looking at the Speaker of the House, who is at this moment saying he may not certify the election results. And, this is a person, Mike Johnson, who has devoted his entire adult life to Christian extremism, to activism on the Christian right, who's in a covenant marriage, who, is a proponent of Christian conversion therapy for gay people, so on the federal level, maybe there's more of a firewall, but if we're talking about the states and we're talking about a significant proportion of the American population, any state with a red trifecta, you can make a pretty credible argument that there are a lot of Americans living in these sort of mini theocracies right now.
Talia, what exactly, your book is called Wild Faith, how the Christian right is taking over America. But you mentioned Johnson, the current Speaker of the House. I heard him on the shows over the weekend. You know a lot more about him. He didn't sound that crazy to me, although maybe that's my problem. On January 6th, for example, there were what I would guess are what you might define as Christian right extremists running around with nooses trying to hang Mike Pence. But Mike Pence used to be called a member of the Christian right. Does this include all Christians, or is there a particular place for the Christian right? Is it just people you don't like? I mean, is Pence in this, even though he's hostile to Trump?
Is Mike Pence a member of the Christian right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he specifically defined himself throughout his life as such, and as governor of Indiana, very much set that kind of agenda. I mean, the reason he was selected as Trump's running mate in the first place was to gain credence with evangelicals. So not all Christians are a part of the Christian right. I'm talking specifically about a movement that's sort of an alliance between white evangelical Protestants and right-wing Catholics that's been ascendant and politically relevant since the 1970s, was instrumental in the election of Ronald Reagan. Figures like Jerry Falwell and Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson, people with really big followings, and their sort of descendants and their spiritual descendants. And at this moment in time, in our chaotic information environment, and this moment of really extreme forces unleashed in our nation, the Christian right has radicalized accordingly. And by the way, it's not just like my opinion that there were Christian extremists at January 6th. There were people who were carrying crosses and holding signs that
to
said
be
an
clear,
appeal to heaven. And
I'm not doubting that. And we've done lots of shows on this. I'm certainly not questioning you on that. Now, my point on Pence is that there is, shall we say, a moral calibration on the right, that Pence clearly took a moral stand. He wasn't willing to do what Donald Trump asked him to do. And there were people on January 6th going around trying to hang him. Now, historically, people always associated him with the Christian right. So my question is, are there moral calibrations within what you call this Christian right? Or are they all intent on taking over America, in your view?
I mean, of course, no group of tens of billions of people is absolutely homogenous. I will say it is telling that, Pence became the subject of such ire given his absolutely spotless, impeccable, evangelical credentials up to that point in time. I mean, there becomes a point at which, following Trump, and sort of making that part of one's political and even religious identity, creates this sort of malleability, where that becomes part of your faith, becomes part of your identity, and you become willing, yes, to turn on even supposed allies. And we saw this even in like the Republican primary in 2016, when these really, Christian right figures like Ted Cruz, who had made that part of his public identity for decades, and Marco Rubio, really fell by the wayside. And then that political movement really became enthralled with Trump, and even at the time started mentioning prophecies that he was sort of this flawed vessel for God's will, that he was a modern day reincarnation of Cyrus, the king in the Bible who allowed the Jews to return and build a second temple, who was a heathen and a Persian, but nonetheless did God's will. And so that was sort of the party line among the most florid factions of the Christian right leading up to the 2016 election. And what we're seeing in this 2024 cycle is that these assassination attempts, particularly the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, where a bullet narrowly missed hitting Trump, has really been folded into this myth of a living martyr. And so in a recent campaign event that returned to the scene in Butler, Pennsylvania, you had J.D. Vance saying that, Donald Trump was saved by God for a higher purpose. You had preachers, reiterating that message, this idea of kind of this living martyr, this man who takes on the ire of the world for you, the faithful, as really this recurrent element in a campaign that is deeply inflected with a right-wing, ecstatic vision of Christianity.
It's interesting you bring up J.D. Vance. I was listening over the weekend to the interview he did with Lulu Garcia Navarro, New York Times. I mean, he presents himself as a very reasonable fellow. He's educated at Yale Law School. He's a best-selling author. When you look at somebody like J.D. Vance, who's, of course, a converted Catholic, fits very much, I'm guessing, into your narrative, when he goes on the New York Times podcast, is he purposely disguising himself? Or are there many J.D. Vances? That's his sell, that he wears many hats and he's always oversimplified by critics on the left. How would you analyze J.D. Vance in the context of your overall argument?
I would describe him almost similarly to Mike Pence, actually, in that in our political press and in our political environment in the U.S., much can be forgiven of someone who can wear a suit and speak in a level tone of voice. And the chief sort of sins are perceived hysteria, perceived sort of over emotionality, etc. So that because J.D. Vance can speak in a calm tone of voice, does have this erudite background, is able to sort of enunciate his views, their extremism is therefore occluded. I mean, this is a man who said things like women should remain in violent marriages. This is a man who's expressed absolute rancid misogyny and contempt for women on every level. This is a man who, you know, advocates for policies that are deeply unpopular, theocratic, and extreme. But because he can wear a suit and say it in a nice tone, his extremism is sort of like for people who, expect extremism to show up ranting and screaming, is sort of occluded that way. But what we saw in that interview is him saying that, Donald Trump didn't lose the 2020 election. This fundamental denial of like a central political reality. And I would say that the chief, like what I've observed of JD Vance, and this is sort of not super relevant to the book, but just he seems to be a bit of a chameleon, someone who will espouse whatever beliefs are necessary for him to attain power, who doesn't really necessarily have super consistent beliefs. I mean, back in 2016, he was calling Trump Hitler, and now is Trump's running mate. So this is a person whose beliefs are malleable in the pursuit of power. That being said, misogyny is a very consistent thread in his life and writings and public speech.
Talia, is there something intrinsic in, I use this, it's not my favorite word, but I can't think of a better one, the ideology of the Christian right in your argument? Is by definition, if you're a member of the Christian right, do you unavoidably, inevitably want to take over America? It leads you towards controlling the dominant cultural, political, perhaps even economic forces in the country? Or can one be a member of the Christian right and still acknowledge, for example, division between church and state?
I think that, once again, like this is not a monolithic or homogenous group. On the other hand, what we're looking at right now, this moment of chaos, of denial of sort of the fundaments of democracy, this moment of really profound both like political unrest, but also sort of existential danger, and this moment in which many women in reported and documented cases are dying as a result of these really execrable theocratic policies. What we're seeing is that, like, over the past 50 years, since the 70s, this is a movement that has sought to cast the American body politic as like the place of battle between good and evil, and it is likewise a movement that has also sought to like build power specifically in order to serve their quote unquote godly agenda. So I think the mindset within this movement, inculcated within this movement, through its methods of, from its methods of child rearing to its views on marriage and the family, and then, also into the public sphere and politics, it's essentially an authoritarian mindset. So I think if you are someone who identifies as a member of the Christian right, who, is participating in this movement and feels consonant with its goals, I do think it is fundamentally an authoritarian movement, and one that is incompatible with a multiracial democracy and a multi-creedal democracy. This is very much unapologetically and sincerely a faith movement that seeks to enfold politics within it and to impose a vision of a Christian nation with a very narrow and ultimately quite sadistic view of Christian morality that it seeks to impose on 300 million people, many of which are of different faiths and or of no faith at all.
So there's something profoundly un-American about these people, in your view?
I don't know about un-American. We were, after all, like a country founded by Puritans who escaped England because they were too religiously extreme for the post-English Civil War environment. So, yeah, I don't know about un-American. I'm always hesitant about arguments that conflate American with good. Just because I don't think that is that has always been true. I do think it is a movement that is fundamentally incompatible with
Democracy.
American democracy.
Well, that's my it's my headline, Talia. Yeah. The right,
Yeah.
Christian right is fundamentally incompatible with American democracy. You may be right. A couple of years ago, we had Margaret Atwood on the show, of course, the great author, the great Canadian author of particularly Handmaid's Tale. It's almost as if, at least in your narrative, these people read Atwood's dystopia, but actually read it as a utopia.
Well, actually, not to actually, the reason why Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale when she did was because she was observing the rise of the Christian right in real time. In other words, she was looking at these public figures and she was sort of extrapolating from their rhetoric what they wanted for the public sphere and for women. And she, wrote this dystopia based directly on the political rhetoric she was seeing around her. So that, yes, it's absolutely true that that the reality they want is The Handmaid's Tale, but that's because she wrote The Handmaid's Tale to reflect what she was seeing around her from the Christian right.
Yeah, it's the cult of birthing. I think there's a better word for that. I can't remember it, but certainly
natalism.
Yeah, the cult of natalism, of women. The whole point of women, I mean, that's the narrative, of course, in the book. The whole point of women is to have babies. I mean, you certainly have that with J.D. Vance, is his argument about the role of women in all this. I mean, and of course his critique of women who choose for one reason or another not to have kids. Are there, and you've done a lot of research, Talia, you're a very good journalist. Are there many women in this Christian right, and how do they make sense of it in terms of their gender?
Yeah, I mean, and I talk about this and sort of struggle with it a little in the book, and it is sort of inherently kind of a fascinating dynamic. But yeah, there are many women in the Christian right, and we can look, even towards its beginnings with Phyllis Schlafly, who was famously Mrs. America. She was this, she sort of created this broad coalition that defeated the Equal Rights Amendment that would have enshrined, a protection against gender discrimination in the Constitution. She also really helped bridge the divide between Protestant evangelicals and reactionary Catholics in the U.S. and helped form the broad-based coalition that we're seeing now. So, I mean, I think there have always been female leaders in this movement. Many of them are sort of pastors' wives and position themselves as such. Schlafly was like, I'm a housewife, even though she was also this incredibly prolific, lucrative public speaker. Many of them define themselves as sort of the voice for mothers or voice for daughters, sort of taking on these traditionally feminine identities. I call them sort of Valkyries for female submission. It is a curious position to be in. That being said, I think it does make sense within the context of looking at the perceived stakes that these people believe themselves to be fighting for. In other words, if you believe that you are fighting for a kingdom of Christ on earth, if you believe that you are, ushering in this godly era that will lead to Christ's return, if you believe you're thwarting Lucifer with what you say, then yeah, like transgressing the sort of gender roles and being this outspoken leader, it may on the surface seem hypocritical, but there's no hypocrisy. There's no such thing as hypocrisy in holy war. It's irrelevant. And then the other thing is that this is how many women feel called by God, right? They describe themselves as being called by God or heaven sent or pushed by the Spirit to make these pronouncements, to be these public figures.
Do you
So
think
yes.
that sometimes when secularists in particular hear that, they think it's a bit of a scam? Are these people really hearing this, or are they using it as an excuse to hate women and leftists and people of other color skins?
I think intent is always trumped by impact. So I am not really in the business of trying to read other people's minds. I think, though, when people say that they are sincerely faithful and that they are pursuing an avid and sincerely felt religious faith, why not take them at their word? It is very possible to believe all the more sincerely because your religious action will ultimately be consonant with your values and your pursuit of power. So I don't think these two things are incompatible at all.
Talia, how is your notion of what you call the Christian right, how is it bound up with right-wing extremism? We did a show, we've done many shows on this one with our Derek Black, who was the godson of David Duke. He had a best-selling book earlier this year, Rising Out of Hatred. Is this the old Klan reinvented in the shape of Christian extremism, or are these parallel movements? Are they connected?
It's a good question. And my first book, Culture Warlords, was about neo-Nazis in the US.
And that's why I asked, because you did this first book, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. So you're very familiar with both worlds.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, first of all, many extreme elements in the US, both in the past and the present, including the Klan, have adopted Christianity and the sense of being the defenders of Christianity or true American Christianity as part of their identity. So these things are historically consonant; they rhyme with our past. I would say, though, that the contemporary Christian right, it does differentiate itself from these more extreme elements in some ways. Although, of course, the Klan were famously sort of anti-Catholic warriors for a vision of
Exactly. Yeah.
white Protestantism. I would also point to the roots of the modern Christian right, which very much came in the 70s, in the aftermath of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruling that desegregated public schools. So in the aftermath of that, a rash of schools all throughout the South began cropping up. They were parochial schools. They had church or Christian in the name, and this is documented in NAACP reports at the time. And so all of these parochial schools were all white schools. They were known as segregation academies. In other words, ways to subvert the fact that public education was now integrated, or de jure integrated. And in the 70s, the government really started to crack down on these schools, or at least say you can't be a tax exempt religious institution and be segregated. You can't be both. And this, even applied to like some of the main figureheads of the movement. Jerry Falwell was audited and so on. And in response specifically to this this crackdown on segregation, that's when the Christian right, as we know it now, was sort of formed as a political force. This profound mobilization of, a previously relatively apolitical, although right-leaning, white Protestant population, the Southern Baptists, these really big denominations that had previously sort of considered politics worldly and beneath them, and sort of not out like places for a holy congregation to insert itself. As a direct result of the government like intervening about segregationism, this movement mobilized profoundly and began to take political action and define themselves on the political right. And it was only later in the late 70s and 80s that, thanks to the efforts of Catholic reactionaries like Phyllis Schlafly, like Paul Weyrich, this guy who helped found the Heritage Foundation and was known as sort of the Robespierre of the right, and Leonard Leo, founder of the Federalist Society, where sort of saying like, hey guys, if you want to build a bigger and broader audience, you can't just stick to segregation now, segregation forever. That's not going to win you many sympathetic converts. Why don't you adopt abortion as sort of this new civil rights struggle, the struggle for the liberation of the unborn, who conveniently aren't going to talk back. And so you really see this incredible shift. As late as 1974, the Southern Baptist Convention was voting like in favor of abortion. Abortion was seen as this fringe Catholic issue. And then suddenly you see this huge shift into championing the rights of the unborn, and, at the same time, engaging in much broader reactionary sentiment against the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, all of these social progressive movements that had been gaining traction in the American mid-century. So I think that, just to return to your question, I think American white nationalism and extremism is quite consonant, if not always directly overlapping with, a movement that had its roots in segregationism and is very much a white political identity. Who are militantly anti-immigrant, and this shows up in polls, and who are fundamentally a force for reaction in the American body politic.
You mentioned Leonard Leo. We've done a lot of shows on these issues. One with Ann Nelson. I'm sure you're very familiar with her work. Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. I think actually Ann has a new book coming out early next year. She focuses on the dark money. I mean, I don't know how dark it is. We know that it's Leonard Leo. Why is this different, though, Talia, from any other group? I mean, Phyllis Schlafly started out as a tiny minority within her own party. Isn't this the nature of politics, that you look for funding, you look for issues, and that's just the nature of things? Why is this different from any other group?
Well, isn't it, I would counter by saying, isn't it in the nature of political commentary to point out trends that we find harmful and frightening in our country? I mean, I think the sort of MAGA movement is sort of sui generis. There have been gestures towards this kind of revanchist populism in American history, certainly. but to have it have this broad a constituency, to be this close to a kind of to power while also openly espousing dictatorship and absolutism, we are in this, I would argue that we are in this uniquely perilous moment, and that this uniquely perilous moment was sort of shaped uniquely by the Christian right, which has been very deliberately building power over the last 50 years. And I would say, yes, having a movement that is this openly theocratic, this openly authoritarian, and this close to achieving the consolidation of power that they've been building over half a century. It's a remarkable closing of the ranks. It's a remarkable level of internal discipline. And so, and also, their goals are sort of um, just poisonous to so many people, to women, to children. We're talking about a movement that actively seeks to curtail the freedom of so many Americans.
It's the un-American argument. The more I listen to you, Talia, it resonates perhaps with some of the anti-communism of the 1950s. Do you think that there are similarities in some ways between this critique of the Christian right and the kind of fear of communism that Americans believed was taking over their country in the 1950s?
Are you calling me a McCarthyist?
I'm not calling you personally a McCarthyist, but it seems to be the same idea that there are these dark un-American forces that want to take the country over, and that they're dangerous and they're everywhere.
I mean, I would again say, like, un-American is your word, it's not mine. I think this is a profoundly American movement. It was, born out of American sentiment, and it is born and bred here, the cross and the flag, So I don't think I'm a McCarthyist, or my viewpoint is
No, I didn't suggest that.
no. Even me, not even me. I don't think people concerned about the rise and rise of the Christian right are seeking out or hunting enemies. We're not HUAC. We're not sort of like the House Un-American Activities Committee, where we're seeking out opponents wherever they may be hidden. These are people who are very openly stating exactly what they want, which is to refashion America as a kingdom of Christ on earth. And so, it would be one thing if I were like going about sort of seeking these hidden symbols, or like really digging up something that needed to be unearthed. In fact, what I'm doing is just observing what is playing out in the public sphere. I would also say that it's ironic that you would specifically gesture at anti-communism, because the McCarthyist movement specifically was one of those things that really produced this strong right-wing tendency in American churches. So, like, this idea of the godless communists are taking over the US was very much one of the forces that sort of began to galvanize the Christian right as people with a distinct political identity. And this even goes back to like profound opposition from pastors to FDR and the New Deal as sort of, again, like godless communism, and like saying that he was the Antichrist. Which was
it'd be interesting if we could bring J. Edgar Hoover back to life. He might be well part of this new Christian right. We talked about women and the Christian right. What about the generational element? We did a show a couple of years ago with Kyle Spencer, who had an interesting book out at the time called Raising Them Right, the untold story of America's ultra-conservative youth movement and its plot for power. These subtitles, probably we can blame publishing companies, seem to be the same. There's always a plot for power. Is there a strong generational element here, or in terms of young people? Are what you call the Christian right very active, for example, on university campuses?
So that's a complicated question. I mean, we are at a moment where American youth, and particularly young women, in a marked way, are moving away from organized religion, partially because they don't find the most visible expressions of religion, which have been for the last couple of generations the Christian right, to be consonant with their values. So, like, American youth broadly may have issues with the Christian right. That being said, a great deal of the book is taken up by my by interviews with many former evangelicals about how they experienced discipline and child rearing and homeschooling growing up in these families. And so what I found was this tremendously, almost brutally punitive view of children.
Yeah,
Um,
corporal. I know you've talked about the evangelical obsession with corporal punishment.
Yes, and that does make up, quite a bit of the book, is talking to people who survived that kind of childhood. Um, and I think, first of all, just as a human phenomenon affecting tens of millions of American kids, that's something to remark upon. And I had many ex-evangelicals, who read some of my initial reporting on this, and then also responding to that book excerpt you just showed on screen, um that was published in New York Magazine, um say, wow, like, this really reflects my childhood in a way that I haven't seen publicly discussed. I think it is under discussed, but also, if you want to question, like, how are so many people espousing these authoritarian principles that seem to be not consonant with the values of American democracy. You know, like, if one place you can look, and it's a dark place to look at, but if you look at the past 40 years of the quote unquote biblical parenting movement, as people like James Dobson and many generations of imitators have called themselves, what you see is a regime of violently enforced obedience. I mean, we're talking beatings, like, pretty widespread and enthusiastic, not just like a support, but like embrace of corporal punishment, and with the idea of producing, and I'm quoting directly from parenting manuals here, instant and joyful obedience. And that's the goal. That what you want is a kid who's not necessarily thoughtful or kind or inquisitive or any of those things, but rather a child who is obedient. And so if you take that as a parenting philosophy for tens of millions of Americans, and then apply that across multiple generations, what you have is a broad populace that has been trained to embrace obedience and authority, and this very, like, this view of obeying violent authority as sort of not even second nature, like this kind of stuff,
What's the
this kind
law
of
on that,
discipline applied. um
Talia? With you know way more about this than me. Are parents allowed to use corporal punishment with their children?
Yes. In fact, the US is remarkably, like, enthusiastic about this. There's absolutely zero regulation. I mean, you're not allowed to kill your child.
I
Like,
should hope not.
but you are absolutely allowed. There's no state in the US that has any anti-corporal punishment laws. there are about 20 states where corporal punishment is permitted in schools. Although in some cases parents have to sign a waiver. And you can imagine what, parents who sign like waivers saying, "Oh yeah, totally fine if you beat my kid," what that home life is like. Um, so like I would also add that the US is the only country in the entire world. South Sudan was the previous holdout, but they signed it in 2015, that hasn't signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Because specifically when it was brought out in the 80s, the government at the time was like, this is gonna offend evangelicals.
Yeah, it's
I mean, the
interesting
US
that
is
this movement that you write about is both, perhaps violently pro-abortion and against abortion. Sorry, that was a bit of a slip. And at the same time, very sympathetic to corporal punishment. I'm not sure what that tells us about the cult of the child.
well, I think that it speaks to the primacy of souls over bodies. If you look at the theological like justifications for why you should, beat the crap out of your kid, literally from before they can talk. In the case of many of these parenting manuals, and I'm talking, these books have sold tens of millions of copies. I'm not talking about some, like weird fringy stuff. Like James Dobson's books, Dare to Discipline and The Strong-Willed Child, sold a ton of copies. So these are not like wildly fringe ideas. And it speaks to, first of all, it's this very Protestant theology of like, well, man is born in a state of sin. So like when a baby cries, that's an expression of its inherent selfishness. There's no sort of point of innocence as humans.
Is there anything legitimate about this? I mean, you're obviously not a big fan. I mean, some of this has acquired a degree of intellectual credibility. People like Patrick Deneen, his book Why Liberalism Failed was a bestseller. What do you make of so-called philosophers like Deneen who are making this ideology mainstream, or this lifestyle mainstream?
I'm not familiar with Janeen's work, but I think, these are popular ideas. That doesn't mean they're right. Like the fact that tens of millions of Americans like absolutely believe that they should, beat and harm their sinful children until they, evince joyful and instantaneous obedience, like doesn't mean that means it's like morally correct or fine. I would also add that people, I can't speak to Deneen specifically, but that every movement requires its sort of sophistic, palatable,
The
mainstream
strongman, it's David
voices.
Duke. It's a couple more questions, Talia. I know you got to run. I appreciate your time. You've been very generous.
Well, I mean, it's just like you can put an idea in a suit and you can put it in a crisply written bestseller, and that doesn't make it right.
No, and I certainly wasn't suggesting that. You're not the first or the last, as you know, Talia, to write about this stuff. I mean, we've had Ann Nelson on the show. She's got a book coming out next year. Lots of other people have written all sorts of books about this. Where do you think your new book, out today, Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America, where is it original? What are you saying that hasn't been said before?
I think I have a couple of different elements. So, one, I am not Christian. I grew up Jewish. So I do not have a competing vision of Jesus that I think is the right one. Nor am I an atheist or a secularist in a militant way. I am approaching this with, okay, tell me what you believe. I'll believe that you believe it. I'm not measuring, against an internal yardstick of what I believe to be the correct Christianity, the true Christianity. And I think that sort of moralism does creep into a lot of books about the Christian right. This idea that you've betrayed the faith in some fashion, and that's what I'm chronicling. Like, I am not talking about an internecine religious argument. I'm approaching this as someone who is an observer from the outside and then looking at this movement. The other piece, I think, and this is probably more materially interesting and, really does, I think, distinguish the book from, as you said, the many others on this topic, is I focus specifically on the effects on women and children, and
Mm.
specifically children, the way children are specifically denied rights, again, the primacy of corporal punishment, and the way that this kind of upbringing has impacted generations of Americans, and what this kind of domestic tyranny says about the political movement in the body politic writ large. So I think that emphasis is fairly unique. I have not seen it addressed elsewhere. And certainly, again, I've had myriad ex-evangelicals say, like, I feel finally that someone has described my childhood and its political ramifications for the very first time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with all the books, but I think your angle is a particularly important and very chilling one. This idea of the cult of violence. As a parent, and obviously as a child at one point in my life, that resonates. So, you mentioned that you have a Jewish background. You in Culture Warlords, you wrote more specifically about anti-Semitism. The relationship between the Christian right and Jews and Zionism is a complicated one, isn't it? Of course, historically, the Klan were against the Jews and the radical right was against the Jews. But there's this weird love-hate relationship between the Christian right and Judaism, or is that oversimplified?
No, you're not wrong. The way I put it is an evangelical Christian loves a Jew like a hungry man loves a chicken wing.
Whoa.
It's this sort of desire to consume.
That's another headline. I might have to put that one in instead. Say that again.
An evangelical Christian loves a Jew like a hungry man loves a chicken wing.
Oh, that's a
Eh,
beautiful Talia. You should have called the book that. It should have come with the subtitle. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
yeah, it's a little wordy for a subtitle. But yes, I totally understand that you're after hosting many authors, you're like, why are all these subtitles so apocalyptic? Well, we got to sell books somehow, and I didn't write it, but you know, uh, anyway, so what we're seeing actually right now unfold during this horrifying war in Gaza is the efflorescence of a very particular evangelical movement called Christian Zionism. And like, what is Christian Zionism? Well, if you look at it, it's actually prophecy based. There are tens of millions of American kids who grow up with the idea of Israel is God's timepiece. What happens to Israel is basically going to determine the prelude to the end of the world. And that an essential precondition for Jesus's return is for all the Jews to be gathered in Israel, for Israel to be under Jewish dominion, and then Jesus will come back and um, convert all the Jews, and then those who accept him will be subsumed into Christianity, and those who don't will be cast into a pit of fire. But this is one of the first acts that will happen during the second coming. But that an essential precondition, a trigger condition, as it were, for Jesus's return, is this ingathering of the Jews to Israel, is this dominion of Jews over uh, dominion of Jews over the land of Israel. And so, you know, Christians United for Israel, the biggest Christian Zionist organization in the U.S., has 10 million members, significantly more Jews than there are significantly more members of Christians United for Israel than there are Jews in the United States. And so, essentially, this is a movement that has poured lots and lots of money into settlements in the West Bank, that has constantly, and you can even see it in like um, Bush era stuff about like Palestine policy was influenced by this movement of sort of slow walking peace with the Palestinians, because Palestinians in this worldview like are just obstacles to this dominion and of the Jews, and therefore Jesus's return. But ultimately, what really strikes me is that this is a fantasy of, annihilation. This is a fantasy of the ones that convert, can live, and the ones that, uh, do not are cast into a lake of fire. So it's sort of like with friends like these, who needs enemies? Of course, a lot of Jews sort of say, well, I'll worry about that when Jesus comes back. Um, you know, but it makes for some pretty rough bedfellows. And just in my experience, when you talk to um, evangelicals as a Jew, they get like really excited about the prospect of converting you. It's like you're extra special. Because like, I don't know what it's like almost a fetishistic
I'm speaking of
view. Yeah.
fetishistic. I'm not going to make any jokes about rough bedfellows. I'll get into trouble. But kind of,
Oh, no.
or corporal punishment. There's all sorts of satire we could make of all this. Finally, you've been, as I said, very generous with your time. It's an important subject. We've done, as I said, many shows on this alternative America, shall we say. One last week with the great Berkeley sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild. She has a new book out, Stolen Pride, Lost Shame and the Rise of the Right. Arlie went, she's a personal friend of mine, she went to Kentucky. And while she's certainly a woman on the left, she went looking to make more sense in sociological terms, shame and loss and pride. I wouldn't say she's sympathetic to the right, but she gives it a human dimension. Is there anything, I mean, you've spent a lot of time looking at this Christian right. You clearly don't like it. You're no fan of it. But is there anything about it that you admire? Is there stuff about the Christian right that you think to yourself, well, that's not so bad? Maybe if progressives could learn from that, then American progressives would be stronger or more, or be viewed more sympathetically by more Americans?
Oh boy. Well, ruthless will to power, willingness to create coalitions, despite really manifest, like Catholic, just like, the Reformation wasn't that big a deal. Let's get together.
Rough bedfellows, as you would say.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of cross-national power building, ruthlessness, that kind
That's
of
the
willingness
Leninist
to.
element, the Steve Bannon element. What about Talia? I mean, even if this idealism, you clearly are no great fan of what their idealism, should we have any admiration for the fact that they believe in something?
I mean, connection lost. Can you?
No, you're still
hear
here.
me
The
okay?
God is still allowing you to speak.
Oh, well, I mean, just if the American left had like a fraction of that determination and willingness, like we would be in a as a country. But
Can I step on the sea?